In the last light of a November afternoon, on the road that runs from Berwick up toward the Grey House at Oakenmuir, a hired chaise stopped where no traveler ever stopped, at a broken gate between two rowan trees, and the man who climbed down from it stood a long while with his hand on the latch, as if the latch itself might tell him whether he was welcome. The gate had not been mended in 9 winters. The rowans, which had been planted by a bride long since laid in the kirkyard, had grown into the shape of 2 women bending toward each other over a secret. And the house beyond them, low and long and gray, with its slate roof patched in 3 colors and its chimneys, smoking only at the west end, looked less like a seat than like a ledger left open in the rain. He did not go in. He looked, and he weighed, and he went back to the chaise, and told the driver to carry him on to the inn at the crossroads, for he wished, he said, to arrive in the morning, when a man could see what he was about. He was said to be the Duke of Ardmere, though no one on that road knew him by sight, and he had come, though no one on that road yet knew it either, to marry the woman who owned the ruined gate. Everything that followed began in that hour, at that latch, and to understand the price of it, you must first understand the debt. The debt was old. It had been contracted in a year when the woman at Oakenmuir was still a child of 26 months, and her father, Sir Malcolm Kincraig, had signed a paper he did not read at a table in Edinburgh, in a room where 3 lawyers coughed politely, and a 4th said nothing at all. Sir Malcolm was a gentleman and a poor manager, and the paper committed him, in the event of certain deaths, to sell certain lands, and in the event of certain other deaths, to sell certain other lands, and in the last event of all, to leave what remained to whichever of his children survived him, together with such obligations as had been quietly gathered against his name like snow against a north wall. The lawyers went home. Sir Malcolm went home. The child at Oakenmuir grew up believing that her house was hers, and that a house is a thing one keeps by loving it well. She was not asked, she was expected, and by the time she was 26 herself, and had buried a mother and a father and 2 brothers and 1 sister, she had also, without knowing it, become the sole living signatory to a document which no one in Scotland but 4 men had ever read. Her name was Isobel Kincraig, and she was, in the phrase of the parish, a spinster whom no one wanted. She had been offered once, at 19, to a cousin who took a chill and died before the banns could be called, and once, at 23, to a widower with a mill who withdrew when he saw the state of the accounts. Since then, the country had spoken of her as a settled thing, and she had not troubled to unsettle it. She rose at 5. She lit her own fire, for the girl who came from the village slept late in winter, and Isobel would not scold her. She kept the books of the farm in a neat straight hand, with an italic capital for every rent day and a small red mark against every tenant in arrears, which she then, in a different ink, forgave. She mended what could be mended. She wore a gray stuff gown that had been dyed twice, and a plaid shawl her mother had woven when Napoleon was still an idea in a schoolroom. She was said by the minister to have the plainest face and the truest tongue in 3 parishes, and by the minister's wife to be the sort of woman who would die owing no one anything except an explanation of why she had not lived. The minister's wife was not a cruel woman. She was merely a woman who could not conceive of a life without a husband in it, and Isobel forgave her that, as she forgave the tenants, and as she had begun, in the long evenings when she sat over the ledger and heard the wind in the rowans, to forgive herself for having hoped otherwise once. She did not know, that November afternoon, that a chaise had stopped at her gate. She was in the west parlour, which was the only room she now heated, and she was doing what she did every Tuesday between 4 and 6, which was answering letters. There were 3 that day. One was from her cousin Margaret in Perth, who wrote twice a year to complain of her husband and to inquire after Isabel's health in the same sentence, so that it was not clear which was the greater ailment. One was from the factor at Craigmore, saying that the roof of the north byre had let in the last rain and would need slates before Candlemas, or there would be no byre by Whitsoon. And one, the third, was in a hand she had never seen before, on paper thicker than any paper in the house, sealed with a crest she did not recognize, and postmarked London. She held it a long moment before she opened it, for she had learned that letters on thick paper are rarely kind. Then she cut the seal with the little knife her father had used for the same purpose, and she read it again, and she folded it in half along the crease already made in it, and set it under the inkstand, and returned to the letter from Craigmore about the byre, because the byre was a thing she understood, and the letter under the inkstand was not. It informed her, in 6 courteous lines, that a gentleman styling himself the Duke of Ardmere would wait upon her the following morning, upon a matter of business long standing between their families, and that he begged the favor of an hour of her time. She had never in her life heard the name Ardmere. She sat until the fire burned down to a red eye and a gray lid, and she did not add another peat, for peats were counted, and the letter would keep whether she was warm or cold. He came, as promised, at 11. She met him in the west parlor, standing, with her hands folded at the waist of the gray stuff gown, and her plaid shawl set aside on the settle, so as not to seem to be hiding behind it. He was a tall man of perhaps 32, with a face that had learned very young not to say what it thought, and eyes of the pale gray that in some lights is nearly no color at all. He bowed exactly the correct depth for a duke greeting a lady of unclear rank in a house of undoubted decay, which is to say, an inch shallower than courtesy and half an inch deeper than condescension, and Isabel, who had been trained by her mother to read bows as other women read faces, noted the measurement and did not smile. He said his name. She said hers, though he plainly knew it. He asked leave to sit. She gave it. He sat and looked once, briefly and without insolence, around the room, the mended curtain, the darned rug, the single peat glowing on the hearth like a small red animal. And then he looked at her, and he did not look away again while he spoke, which she counted, silently, in his favor. He said that he had come upon a matter that would seem, at first hearing, improbable, and that he asked her only to hear the whole of it before she answered. She said that she would hear the whole of anything and answer nothing until she had. He inclined his head as at a sensible reply, and began. He said that 24 years before, her father had signed a paper in Edinburgh. He named the room and the month and the 3 lawyers who had coughed, and the 4th who had said nothing. He said that the 4th lawyer, who was now himself dead, had been in the service of the late Duke of Ardmere, his own grandfather, and that the paper had been drawn to settle a debt of honor older than either of them, a debt contracted in a card-room in the year 1798 and never spoken of afterward by either party, save in ledgers kept in locked drawers. He said that under the terms of that paper, upon the extinction of the male line of Kincraig, which had occurred, he was sorry to remind her. At her brother Robert's death 9 winters past, certain lands lying between the Tweed and the sea, together with the mineral rights beneath them and the fishings above them, reverted not to the crown, as she had been given to understand by her father's man of business, but to the house of Ardmere, in trust for the eldest surviving Kincraig, to be administered by the Duke on her behalf until such time as she should marry, at which point they were to be settled upon her issue. He said that these lands, which the country still called by their old names, and which she had believed sold in the year of her father's death to pay his creditors, had in fact never been sold. He said that they comprised, at his own last surveying, some 92,000 acres, upon which stood 3 villages, 4 collieries, and a harbor, and that their annual rental, after all charges, exceeded £17,000 sterling. He said that he had come, therefore, to lay before her 2 proposals. The first, that he continue as her trustee, remitting to her the whole income less his own necessary charges, in which case she would remain, as she had always been, a spinster of Ocean Moor, and would be, from this day, the richest unmarried woman between the Forth and the Tyne. The second, that she consent to become his wife, upon terms he would state plainly and without embellishment, in which case the lands would pass, at the ceremony, into their joint hands, and the debt of honor between their 2 houses would, at last and forever, be discharged. He said, finally, that he was not asking her to answer that day. He was asking her to hear him say it and to believe that he had said it truly. And he stopped, and he waited, and he did not once, in the whole of that speech, look at the mended curtain, or the darned rug, or the single-peat, and Isobel, who had been counting the seconds of his composure as she would have counted the beats of a horse's stride, found at the end of them that her own hands, folded at her waist, were perfectly still, and that this steadiness was a thing she had learned to do well. She said, when she could trust her voice, that she would like to see the paper. He drew it from a leather case and laid it upon the small table between them, and she read it, twice, in the same manner in which she had read the letter under the inkstand the day before, and she saw that it was as he had said, and she saw also, in the 4th clause, that her father's signature was in the hand of a man who had been drinking, which she had not known, and she was sorry for him afresh, at 24 years' distance, as if he had died again that morning. She said that she would like to know why he had chosen to come himself, when a man of business would have served. He said that a man of business would not have served, for the matter was one of honor, and honor did not travel in another man's carriage. She said that she would like to know why he had proposed marriage, when trusteeship alone would have satisfied the paper. He said, with the evenness that is only held in place by effort, that he had proposed marriage because he was 36, and had not married, and had reached the age at which a man either marries for the reasons his rank requires, or resigns himself to leaving his name to a cousin he does not like, and because he had been shown, in the surveying of her estate, ledgers kept in a hand so careful and so just that he had wished, before he saw her face, to know the woman who kept them, and because, having now seen her face, he found that his wish had not been mistaken. He said this without gallantry, in the flat voice he kept for facts, and she heard in it, without being told, that he had rehearsed the sentence on the road from London, and had struck out one word that would have given him away, and put back another that was truer. And she was not sure, at that moment, whether she liked him for the rehearsal or for the striking out, but she noted, silently, that she did not dislike him for either. She said that she would give him her answer in a week. He rose. He bowed, this time to precisely the correct depth. He said that he would lodge at the inn at the crossroads, and would call again on the following Tuesday, at 11, and that he asked her, in the interval, to spend nothing of the £17,000, for it was hers whether she married him or not, and he did not wish her to feel that his suit was made from her own purse. She said that she had never in her life spent money she did not know she had, and did not propose to begin. He almost smiled. He did not. He went out, and the door closed behind him, with the small definite sound of a door in a well-kept house, though the house was not well kept, and Isobel stood a long while in the middle of the west parlor, with her hands still folded at her waist, and thought, quite calmly, that she had been a fool for 26 years, and that being a fool was a thing one might, with a little care. Cease to be. We will take a very short break here. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe so you will not miss what happens next. Truth, once led into a house, walks through every room in it. In the week that followed, Isobel walked through hers. She opened cupboards she had not opened since her mother's death, and found, in the linen press, 4 sheets of a quality she had forgotten the family had ever owned, folded with lavender long since turned to dust. She found, in the muniment room, a bundle of her father's letters tied with a black ribbon, and read them and did not weep, and set them aside for burning. She went out to the buyer at Craigmore with the factor and looked at the sagging slates, and told him to mend them before Candlemas, whether there were money for it or not, for she would answer for the money. And the factor, who had known her since she was 6, looked at her a long moment and said, "Aye, mistress," and did not ask her where the money was to come from, for he had known her long enough to know that when she said a thing, she meant it. She wrote 3 letters, one to her cousin Margaret in Perth, saying that she would not, this year, be able to visit at Christmas, for she had matters at home to attend to, one to the minister's wife, thanking her for a jar of bramble jelly and returning the jar, and one, the longest, to no one, in which she set down, in 2 columns, what she stood to lose, and what she stood to gain by each of the 2 courses the Duke had laid before her, and at the bottom of which she wrote, in the same neat straight hand in which she kept the rent book, the single sentence, "I do not know this man, but I know his ledger, and his ledger is honest." She burned the letter in the hearth. She did not burn the sentence out of her head. On the Monday, the day before he was to return, an old woman came to the kitchen door and asked for her. It was Elspeth Nairn, who had been her mother's woman and who now lived on a small pension Isobel could not properly afford in a cottage at the end of the West Drive. Elspeth was 79 and had, she said herself, no time left for polite conversation. She sat down in Isobel's chair, uninvited, and Isobel poured her a cup of tea, and Elspeth drank half of it and set the cup down and said, "Isobel Kincraig, ye will tell me what the tall man in the grey coat wanted at this door on Tuesday, or I will not stir from this chair until ye do." Isobel, who had loved Elspeth Nairn since she was 3, told her. Elspeth listened without moving. When Isobel was done, Elspeth said, "And what will ye do?" Isobel said, "I do not know." Elspeth said, "Ye do know. Ye have known since Tuesday at 11:30. What ye do not know is whether ye have the courage to do it, and that is a different thing, and one I can help you with." She reached across the table and took Isobel's hand in her own, which was thin as a bird's foot and warm as a fresh loaf, and she said, "Child, I am 79. And I have watched 3 generations of Kincraig women die of pride in this house, and I did not save your mother, for I did not know then what I know now, and I will not watch ye do it. Ye will marry the man. Ye will marry him on his terms and on yours, and ye will not pretend to love him, for ye do not, and he does not ask it, and ye will not pretend to be marrying him for the lands, for ye are not, though the lands will do very well, and ye will marry him, because he came himself, when he could have sent a man of business, and because he did not look at the mended curtain, and because he struck out one word and put back another, and because, Isobel Kincraig, ye are 26, and ye have been alone since ye were 17, and a woman is not made to be alone that long, whatever the minister's wife may tell ye." Isobel said, very quietly, "You do not know that he struck out a word." Elspeth said, "I have been in the world long enough to know that a man who says a thing in that voice has struck out a word and put back another. Now finish your tea and go to bed, and in the morning ye will tell him yes, and you will tell him also the 3 conditions I shall now name to ye, for he is a duke. And dukes must be met with conditions, or they forget that they are being met at all. And she named them, in the tart, cheerful voice of a woman too old to be argued with, and Isobel wrote them down, for they were sensible, and she had, in any case, meant to name 2 of them herself. He came at 11. She had lit a second peat, which was as near to ceremony as the house could rise to, and she had put on the grey stuff gown, for she had no better, and she had unfolded the plaid shawl on the settle where she had folded it away the week before, so that it was there, but not upon her, which she thought a fair statement of her position. He bowed. She curtsied, which she had not done on Tuesday, and she saw him note it. And note also that it was the smallest curtsy consistent with courtesy, and she saw, in the faint alteration of his mouth, that he understood the measurement and approved of it. He sat. She sat. She said, I will marry you, upon 3 conditions. He said, name them. She said, first, that the lands at Craigmore, being the smallest and poorest of the estates in question, shall be held separately in my sole name, and shall not pass to our issue if we have any, but shall descend, at my death, to whichever tenant on those lands is at that hour most in need of them, to be chosen by the minister of the parish and the factor jointly. In a settlement I shall draw up, and you shall sign. He said, agreed. She said, second, that Elspeth Nairn, who has been in this house since before I was born, shall have her cottage and her pension for life, doubled from the sum I have hitherto been able to pay her, and a girl to fetch her water, and shall be buried, when her time comes, in the Kincraig plot at the kirk, with a stone of her own, cut by a mason of Edinburgh and not of the parish, for she deserves better lettering than the parish can give her. He said, agreed. She said, third, that you shall tell me, before I sign the settlements, what word it was that you struck out on Tuesday, and what word you put back. There was a silence in the west parlor. She counted it. She counted to 9. At 9, he said, in a voice she had not yet heard from him, which was quieter than the flat voice he kept for facts and was not, quite, unsteady. The word I struck out was fond. The word I put back was mistaken. She said, then we are agreed on all 3 conditions. He said, we are. She said, when would you have the marriage? He said, when you would have it. She said, in 3 weeks, at the kirk here, without company, with the minister and Elspeth Nairn and the factor for witnesses, and no breakfast after, for I will not spend on a breakfast money I have not yet learned to think of as mine. He said, without a smile, but with something in the eyes that was near to one, agreed. They were married on a Wednesday morning in the 2nd week of December, in the cold small kirk at Ocean Moor, with the minister reading in the voice he kept for baptisms and funerals both, and Elspeth Nairn upright in the front pew in a bonnet 40 years old, and the factor in a black coat borrowed from his brother, and no one else present but the sexton, who had come in to light the stove and had stayed for the novelty. Isobel wore the grey stuff gown. She had thought, briefly, of the 4 fine sheets in the linen press, and had decided against alteration. She was not marrying in her mother's clothes, nor in the clothes of a woman she was not yet. The Duke wore a coat of black superfine cut in London, and boots that had walked on the road from the inn, and no ornament of any kind but the plain gold ring he had brought in his pocket, which he set upon her finger with a hand that was neither warm nor cold, and did not tremble. She said the words. He said the words. The minister pronounced them man and wife. Elspeth Nairn, in the front pew, made a small sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, and was, Isobel thought, the truest music that Kirk had heard in 20 years. They walked out into a fall of thin snow. He offered her his arm. She took it, for that was the form. They went back to the house, and they sat down to a dinner of broth and mutton, and a pudding Elspeth had made in secret in her own cottage, and had carried up in a covered dish, and they drank 1 glass each of a wine the Duke had sent from the inn, and the factor toasted them in 3 sentences, and left, and the minister in 2 and left after him, and Elspeth in 1. And returned to her cottage in the snow with the empty pudding dish held before her like a lantern, and Isobel and her husband were alone in the west parlor, with 2 peats burning now instead of 1, and the whole of a marriage before them, and no map for it. He was, in that first winter, a man learning the shape of a house that was not his. He did not attempt to change it. He asked, on the 3rd day, whether he might have the muniment room for his papers, and she gave it to him, and he moved in a small mahogany desk from the inn, and a lamp and 3 boxes of documents, and he worked there from breakfast until dinner without asking to be attended to. He asked, on the 7th day, whether she would object to his sending for a mason to see to the chimneys of the east wing, for he had noticed a crack. She said she would not. If the mason was a local man, and the money was drawn from the general account and not from her own, and he agreed. He asked, on the 14th day, whether she would ride with him to see the villages of the Tweedside estate, which were now theirs jointly, for he thought it right that she should know the faces of the people whose rents she now signed for. And she said yes, and she rode out with him on a cold, clear morning on a mare he had bought for her at the Kelso fair without consulting her, which she noted and did not remark upon, for the mare was quiet and had a kind eye, and she had loved it before she had ridden it a mile. He introduced her at each door as the Duchess of Ardmere, which title she was still learning to answer to, and she introduced herself at each door as Isobel Kincraig of Auchenmere, which the villagers understood better, and she saw him note this too, and she saw him, in the doorway of the 3rd cottage, watch her kneel to speak with a child who was on crutches from a fall in a peat cutting. And she saw, when she rose again, that he had turned his face slightly aside and was studying his gloves, which she thought curious, and did not then understand. She came to understand it in small increments across that winter, as the frozen ground about the house yielded, degree by degree, to the sun at noon. She learned from Elspeth, who had it from the Duke's own valet, who had it from a footman in the London house, that the Duke's mother had died when he was 9, in childbirth with a sister who did not live, and that the Duke's father, upon that day, had put every picture of his wife into a locked room, and had not opened the door of that room again for the 21 years until his own death, at which point his son, the present Duke, had opened it, and had found the pictures, and had had them cleaned, and had hung them in a corridor no one used, and had also found on the mantel of that locked room a small carved wooden horse that had been his own at 7, and that he had left there the day his mother died because his mother had liked it, and that he had taken up now and carried in his pocket, and that he carried still. Elspeth told her this in the kitchen, over tea, with the tart, cheerful bluntness of a woman who was giving her a tool and expected her to use it. Isobel did not use it at once. She kept it, as a woman keeps a key she has not yet found the lock for. She learned also from the factor that her husband had, upon taking possession of the Tweedside collieries in trust 9 winters before, personally rewritten the terms upon which the miners were paid, at a cost to the estate of some £400 a year, and had never mentioned it in any account sent to her father's man of business, and she learned, from the minister, that a sum of money had been paid, quietly and without name, 3 years running, to the widow of a shepherd on the Craigmore lands who had been crushed by a fall of stone, and that no one in the parish knew where the money had come from, though the minister had suspected, and now knew. She stored these things, She did not speak of them. In the west parlor, in the evenings, she and her husband sat on opposite sides of the hearth, she with her mending, he with his papers, and they spoke of the weather, and the price of oats, and the letter that had come that day from the factor, and sometimes, when he had drunk his one glass of wine and she her half, of a book they had both read as children. And once, in the 3rd week of January, he laughed, briefly, at something she had said about the minister's wife, and stopped himself and looked for an instant ashamed, and Isabel, without lifting her eyes from her mending, said, "You may laugh in this house. It is permitted." And he said, in the flat voice, "Thank you." And after that, in the evenings, he laughed a little more, though never loudly, and she began to notice that when he laughed his hand went, unconsciously, to his coat pocket, where the small wooden horse lived, as if to reassure it that laughter was not disloyalty, and she loved him then for the first time, though she did not tell him, for he had not asked her to, and would not have believed her if she had. Spring came late that year, as it does on the border. The rowans at the broken gate put out their small tight buds, the byre at Craigmore, mended before Candlemas, held through the March rains, and a letter came from London, on paper thicker than any paper in the house, sealed with a crest Isabel had by now learned to read. It was from the Duke's man of business, a Mr. Callender, and it informed the Duke that certain irregularities had been discovered in the accounts of the Ardmere estates for the years 1815 through 1822, and that the sum unaccounted for, calculated at simple interest, exceeded £11,000, and that the trail led, unmistakably and grievously, to the person of Mr. Hepburn, the Duke's late father's steward, who had served the house for 34 years, and whose manner, the letter noted delicately, had never quite matched his words. The Duke read the letter at the breakfast table. He did not exclaim. He passed it, without a word, across the table to Isabel, who read it, and folded it, and passed it back, and said, "He will not be prosecuted." The Duke said no. She said, "He will be pensioned." The Duke said, "He will be pensioned." She said, "And his wife will not be told." The Duke said, "His wife will not be told." She said, "You have known this since November." The Duke said, "I have suspected it since November. I have known it since Tuesday last." She said, "Then you will go to Edinburgh and settle it and come home." He said, "I will." He went that afternoon. He was gone 11 days. In the 11 days, Isabel discovered, by degrees she did not welcome, that she had come to expect the sound of his boots in the passage between the muniment room and the west parlor at 12:30 each day, and that the absence of that sound was a kind of cold in the house that no Pete could answer. She did not tell Elspeth. Elspeth, who had known it before she had, did not ask. He came back on the 12th day, in a rain that had turned to sleet by dusk, and he came into the west parlor still in his traveling coat, and he stood a long moment in the doorway, looking at her by the fire, and she rose, and he said, "Isabel." It was the first time he had used her Christian name, and he used it as one might use a lamp in a dark passage, to see by. She said, "Alexander." She had not used his either. He said, "It is done." She said, "Sit, take off your coat. There is broth." He sat. He took off his coat. He ate the broth. And when he had eaten it, he said, in the flat voice, though the flatness now had a small tremor in it, as of a hand held very still against the wish to shake, "Isobel, I must tell you something I ought to have told you before we were married, though I did not know then that I would need to tell it." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I did not marry you for the lands." She said, "I know." He said, "I did not marry you for the debt of honor, though the debt of honor was true and is now discharged." She said, "I know that also." He said, "I married you because I read your ledgers in the surveyor's office in Edinburgh over 3 evenings in October, and I saw on the 3rd evening that whoever had kept those ledgers was a woman I could not afford to leave in a house with a broken gate. For such women are not made twice in a century. And I would sooner have died in the road than let another man come up that road ahead of me." He said this, looking not at her, but at his hands, which were folded on the table as she had folded hers at their first meeting, and she saw that they were not quite steady, and she saw that he had again struck out a word and put back another, and this time she did not ask him what the words were, for she knew them both. She sat down opposite him. She unfolded his hands, one and then the other, and she took them in her own. She said, "Alexander, I did not marry you for the lands either." He said, "I did not think you had." She said, "I married you because you came yourself." He said, "I know." She said, "And because Elspeth Nairn told me to." He said, in a voice that had a laugh in it, and did not this time try to keep the laugh out, "God bless Elspeth Nairn." She said, "God does. She has told him so, at length, every night of her life." And they sat that way, with his hands in hers, until the fire burned low, and neither of them added a peat, though there was no longer any reason not to. And when at last he drew one hand free, it was not to withdraw it, but to take from his coat pocket the small wooden horse, and to set it upon the table between them, and to say, "This was my mother's before it was mine. It has been in my pocket every day for 21 years. I should like it to live on your mantel now, if you will have it there." She took it up. She set it, without a word, upon the mantel beside her mother's brass candlestick, where the two of them looked, for a moment, like a small family of their own. And she said, "We shall have to fetch another peat after all." And he said, "I shall fetch it." And he did. There was one blow more to come, for happiness in that country is never given without being tested, and the test came in the shape of a woman named Lady Charlotte Menteith, who arrived at Auchenmere in the last week of April, in a carriage with 4 horses and a maid and a small dog, and who was, she said, an old friend of the Duke's from the London seasons, passing through on her way to her aunt at Kelso, and quite unable to go by without paying her respects to dear Alexander and his. Here she paused with a smile too well made to be honest. His new bride. She was 25 and beautiful in the manner that beauty takes when it has been trained since infancy to be a weapon, and she sat in the west parlor drinking Isabel's tea and admiring Isabel's mended curtain in the voice of a woman admiring a piece of embroidery done by a child, and she told 3 stories about Alexander's mother, whom she had never known, and 2 about Alexander's father, whom she had known too well, and one about Alexander himself at a shooting party in Perthshire, in which he had, she said, been so devoted an admirer of hers that all their friends had thought the matter as good as settled, and had been quite astonished when, here another smile. Dear Alexander had gone north for the winter, and had, in the phrase of the London papers, made so unexpected a match. She said all this in the polite, unraised voice of the well-bred, and she watched Isabel's face throughout for the flinch that would have been her wage, and Isabel, who had learned in the 26 years before her marriage how to hold a face steady against colder winds than this one, gave her nothing, and poured her more tea, and said, in the mildest of tones, that she was very glad to hear it, for she had often wondered what her husband had been about in Perthshire, and now she knew. Lady Charlotte laughed a bright little laugh and stayed to dinner, and stayed the night. For the roads, she said, were treacherous, and in the small hours of the morning, when the house was asleep, Isabel walked once, in her plaid shawl, along the corridor past the guest room, and saw the crack of light beneath the door, and heard, faintly, the sound of a woman crying, not the pretty crying of a woman who wishes to be heard, but the private, ugly crying of a woman who has been alone longer than she can bear and has just discovered, in another woman's mended parlor, that alone is what she is going to be. And Isabel stood a moment in the corridor and did not knock, and did not despise, and went back to her own bed and lay awake till dawn, thinking, without triumph and without pity, that Charlotte Menteith had been a small and frightened person all her life, and had learned to be cruel, because cruelty was the only weapon a small and frightened person of her rank was permitted to carry. And that this did not excuse her, but did explain her, and that Isabel would, in the morning, send her on her way with civility, and would not, ever, mention her again to Alexander unless he mentioned her first, which she was quite certain he would not. He did not. Lady Charlotte went in the morning. The dog barked once at the Rowans, and was silent. The carriage went down the road with 4 horses, and the road took her, and did not bring her back. In the west parlor, at 11, Alexander said, without preface, she was here to see whether I had regretted it. Isabel said, I know. He said, she saw that I had not. Isabel said, I know that also. He said, you are, and stopped, and did not, this time, put back the word he had struck out, but let the silence stand for it, and Isabel, who had learned by now how to complete his silences without embarrassing them, said, I am your wife. He said, you are that. She said, it is enough. He said, it is more than enough. It is dear. And the word, rationed for 6 months and finally spent, hung in the air between them like the note of a bell, and neither of them said any more that morning. But he came, at 12:30, into the west parlor from the muniment room, as he had done every day of the winter, and she was there, as she had been every day of the winter. And the sound of his boots in the passage was, from that day forward, the warmest sound she knew. Summer settled into the border country in its slow, reluctant way, and with it the last reckoning. Old Hepburn the steward, quietly pensioned to a cottage on a small estate in Fife, died there in July of a fever that Isabel believed, and did not say was less a fever than the exhaustion of a man who had lived for 34 years in a lie and had finally been permitted to lay it down. His wife, who had never been told, mourned him honestly, and Alexander paid for the stone. And Isabel wrote the widow a letter that said nothing of the accounts and everything of the man's long service, and the widow wrote back a letter of thanks so plain and so grateful that Isabel put it away in the muniment room in a drawer marked, in her neat straight hand, kept Lady Charlotte Menteith married, in September, a baronet of considerable fortune and no conversation, and settled in Northumberland, and was, by all accounts, not unhappy, which Isabel took when she heard of it as good news, and meant it. The factor at Craigmore mended the west byre, which was found to be worse than the north, and hired a second man to help him, at Isabel's insistence and at Alexander's expense, and the tenant who had lost the shepherd 3 years before was given, without ceremony, the deeds to the cottage she had lived in, so that no one should ever again put her out of it. And she wept at the kitchen door, and could not be persuaded to come in, and Isabel let her weep, for weeping in the open air is a private thing that ought not to be interrupted. Elspeth Nairn lived to see the first Kincraig child born at Auchenmuir in 28 years, a girl in the March of the following year, whom they named Margaret for the cousin in Perth, and Elspeth for the woman in the cottage, and who was baptized in the cold small kirk by the same minister who had married them, in a gown Isobel had cut down from one of the 4 fine sheets in the linen press, and Elspeth held the child, in the front pew, in the bonnet 40 years old, and said, in a voice that did not tremble though her hands did, Isabel Kincraig, ye have done well, and lived another 11 months, and died in her cottage in her sleep in a February thaw, and was buried, as promised, in the Kincraig plot. Under a stone cut by a mason of Edinburgh, with lettering finer than the parish deserved, which read only her name and her dates, and, beneath them, the 2 words she had chosen herself, she loved. The foil to her, old Mr. Nairn, her brother, who had never forgiven her for outliving him in spirit though he was 3 years her junior, would not come to the funeral, and died himself in the autumn, unreconciled to her memory and to most other things, and was buried in a different corner of the same kirkyard, and Isabel saw to his stone as she had seen to Elspeth's, and did not choose the words herself, but let the minister choose them, for she would not lie over a grave, and she would not judge over one either. The child Margaret grew. A boy came after her, whom they named Malcolm for Isobel's father and Alexander for his own, and who inherited, at his birth, the whole of the entailed Ardmere lands and none of the Craigmore ones, which, as the settlement had provided, would go one day to a tenant not yet chosen. The gate at the end of the West Drive, the broken gate between the Rowans, Isobel would not have mended. Alexander, in the 2nd year of their marriage, asked her once whether it should be repaired, and she said no, and did not explain, and he, who had learned by then to read her silences as she had learned to complete his, did not ask again. The Rowans grew. The house was patched, slate by slate, until it no longer looked like a ledger left open in the rain, but only like a gray house on a gray road, well kept, warm at both ends, smoking at all its chimneys in winter. In the west parlor, at 12:30 each day when he was at home, Alexander came in from the muniment room, and Isobel put down her work, and they ate their dinner together, and this was the whole shape of their happiness, and it was enough. Some things it could not repair. It could not bring back her mother, or her father, or her 2 brothers, or her sister. It could not give her back the 9 winters she had spent alone at Auchenmuir, believing that no one would ever come up the road. It could not, though she and Alexander both would have wished it, give him back his own mother, or the sister who had not lived, or the 21 years his father had spent behind the locked door. Some doors, Isobel came to believe, stay shut. That was the price. She paid it every day, and thought it fair, for what she had been given in exchange for it was more than she had ever thought a woman of her plain face and her plain name and her mended gown could hope to be given: the sound of a man's boots in a passage at 12:30, and a small carved wooden horse on the mantel beside her mother's candlestick, and a child in a gown cut down from a linen press sheet, and an old woman's stone in a kirkyard that said only, "She loved." On a November afternoon, some years after all this, when the child Margaret was old enough to walk beside her father down the West Drive, and the boy Malcolm was old enough to be carried on his mother's hip, the 4 of them went together to the broken gate between the Rowans. The gate had not been mended. The Rowans, in fruit, hung over it heavy and red, so that the 2 women who had bent toward each other over a secret now bent toward each other over a small red harvest that no one in the house would gather, for the birds were welcome to it. Alexander lifted the latch, which still worked, and held it open, and Isobel walked through, with the boy on her hip, and Margaret ran through under her father's arm, and Alexander followed and closed the gate behind them, and they stood on the road outside their own house and looked back at it, at its patched roof and its smoking chimneys, and the light already showing in the west parlor, and Alexander said, in the flat voice he still kept for facts, though it had by now a good deal of warmth mixed into the flatness, "It is a fair house." And Isobel said, "It is a fair house now." And the child Margaret, who was 6, said, "Was it not always?" And Isobel said, "No, my dear, it was not always." And that was all any of them said, for it was cold, and the sun was going, and there was a fire waiting, and they went back through the gate and up the drive and into the house. And the door closed behind them with the small, definite sound of a door in a well-kept house, which now the house was. Say of a woman what her ledger says of her, and you will have said the whole truth of her, for the ledger does not lie, and neither, in the end, does the life it keeps. Loss is permanent. So is love. That is the whole of it. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next story.